All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. I'm Tejas Desai. I am the author of Bad Americans Part 1, as well as four other books. This is my latest book, though, and probably the one I'm proudest of. And I'm just going to be talking about it a little bit. Um, so, I'm going to talk a little bit about my inspiration for writing it, how I came to it, a little bit about the book itself. I'll do a brief reading from it, and then we'll have questions and answers. Just out of curiosity, has people in the audience read the book or parts of the book? No, okay. So Ken has. All right. So Bad Americans is a very ambitious and innovative book. It's published in two parts. Part one came out in September, and part two is going to come out next April. And it's a novel with 12 stories within the novel told by the characters in the book. So it's extremely innovative. It's basically inspired by the Decameron and the Canterbury Tales. If you ever read those are works from the Middle Ages. The Decameron it was actually written, at least published, 5 years after the Black Death ended. Um, right outside of Florence, Italy. Basically, 10 privileged Florentines go out to the countryside to escape the pandemic, the Black Death, and they each tell 10 stories each night. And so there are 100 stories in the book, and there's also a frame. But the frame is kind of very simple about them kind of interacting. So, in the Canterbury Tale, similarly, it's about a pilgrimage in England. I believe it's the 5th century, and they're going to like a religious excursion, and each person is from a different, type of English society, and each person tells a story, and they each tell a different type of story. And in this case, they're kind of competing against each other. So I was very inspired by this when I was, especially when I was in college, when I was in university, and then especially when I studied abroad, my junior year abroad at the University of Oxford. I really started reading the Decameron in depth. And that's when I first got the idea. This is 25 years ago. This is 2001, right after September 11th. And I first got the idea. I was like, I really want to do something like this one day. I really want to challenge myself to write a novel that's a frame that also have stories within it. Because my main focus was having both a novel, a, a, a series, a trilogy, and also having a short story collection series, and that's what I've done. My other books, so I can show you that too. Um, this is my other series, The Brotherhood Chronicle. It's a crime series, crime trilogy, set mainly in New York City in the first book, and then in Thailand, India, and Australia. And it involves the struggles of an Indian American private investigator who investigates the death of his childhood friend, and he gets kind of pulled into a greater conspiracy, of ultimately a worldwide conspiracy. So it has a great plot, but it also involves a lot of Hindu and Buddhist themes that I've been very interested in much of my life as I was raised as a Hindu. Um, so that was one of my goals, and my other goal was the human tragedy, which is the other series, which Bad Americans is a part of. It's actually the second book in Bad Americans, and that's an anthology series. So the books aren't necessarily related to each other plot-wise, but they're just thematically related. So in any case, I say all this to kind of go back to the point that I wanted to write a short story collection that was kind of better than the typical short story collection. It would be a novel with stories in it. Um, and the first one, by the way, in this series with Good Americans, so you can see the interplay there. Good Americans was more of a traditional collection. It had 6 short stories, a 3-part novella, and an introduction that was kind of like a playful, kind of a fake introduction to the series. But it also is kind of like pushes the envelope of a short story collection series. A short story collection because it's deals a lot of provocative subjects and themes, mainly set in New York City and its background. But for the second, this was published in 2013. So by 2000, and the Brotherhood was published in 2012. By 2018, I had completed the second and third books of the Chronicle, and I really wanted to publish that. So 2018, I came out with a second edition of the Brotherhood, and sorry, and in 2019 and 20, I come out with the Run and Hide and the Dance Towards Death. So in 2019 or so, I was already thinking about what do I do with my next book, which is going to be the next book, The Human Tragedy. And again, I came back to this concept that I had about 20 years earlier, of what that I wanted to do, a novel with stories in it. And so I was already thinking about setting it during a pandemic because it was, very much inspired by the Decameron, which was set during the Black Death. So I already had this idea of kind of setting it during a pandemic and having people quarantine in the library in this case. I'm a librarian by profession, it kind of made sense. And they would be quarantined, so they would all be kind of like, have the Decameron in the background, they'd all be kind of telling stories to each other. Then in early 2020, I was set to take a trip. I usually take about month-long trips every year internationally. So in this case, I was going to take a trip to Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, some other places, and I got very ill right before my trip. And at this point, we already had heard about the virus in China. They were trying everything they could to contain it in Wuhan, other places, and it was already spreading in Italy and some other places, but we didn't realize it was in the United States. And all my symptoms actually matched. I didn't even realize it at the time, but most likely it probably was COVID that I had. Nevertheless, I had to cancel my trip. I was that sick. Thankfully, I got my money back because the flight was through China, so just got lucky. But so I was out for a month, even so, from work. And by the time I got back to work, we had the lockdown about a week later. So again, my mind is kind of churning. Like the Dance Towards Death was going to be published in September, and so I was like, well, we already have a pandemic that I'm living through. We might as well like kind of evolve what the book and kind of take what's happening and use that. And if you read any of my books, you'll see how committed I am to realism. They're all very realistic. The characters are very vivid, and I'm really dedicated towards that. So again, I saw how things were happening. I saw that people, at least mainly the wealthy, were moving out to the Hamptons, or to other places, and it was the people, the essential workers, people who didn't have much, who were really suffering in real time, especially in New York City. And additionally, my mother worked at Elmhurst Hospital, which was the hardest hit place in all of New York. So I was privy to that. She got sick. She gave it to all of us. We all had the antibodies, so I either got it twice. I don't really know, but so anyway, just to say that I was living through it as it was happening. And then people. My father got very sick. I know people who passed away from it, who were neighbors and family friends. So all of this started churning, and once I published The Dance Toward Death in September, I started serious work on the book. And I thought to myself, well, I got all the characters in my head. I don't know, maybe I just have an innate ability, I'm not really sure, but I had the characters in my head, who they would be, and a pretty good sense of them. And I even had a sense of how the stories they would tell, and the fact that they would all be told in a different style, in spoken word or whatever it might be. But I thought to myself, well, if one person's a social worker, or another person's a lawyer, if another person's a soldier, whatever they might be, how do I get this right? So that's when I thought, well, maybe I should reach out to people who are in those professions and see if they'd be willing to read over the stories and see how accurate they are. So I got a list of those people. I sent out emails and stuff, and a lot of them were willing to help me. So I sent out the stories as I had written them. Obviously people had a lot of criticism. They had lots of suggestions, and so I incorporated that into the stories I was writing as well. So 2, 3 rewrites. The stories were mainly done. The frame narrative, I did a lot of research on this, just trying to keep going to the Hamptons. One person in particular helped me out a lot. I barely knew her in college, but again, I contacted her and she was willing to help me. and she really gave me a lot of details about that. So multiple trips there, multiple, lots of research about what had happened during the pandemic, even though I was living through it myself, um, got me to a very, very big draft, which was massive. And it took me a while to really kind of break it down to something that was, readable, like not readable, and it was already readable, but just something that wouldn't bore the reader, basically. Um, and ultimately, I decided, just like my previous books, to publish it through my own company, The New Way, which is now an author collective of 15 members. I could talk about that too if you'd like. But um, the other thing that I wanted to do, I realized would be a good thing to do, was to publish the stories individually as well, because I realized that the stories also worked uh, as standalone stories, even though they were told by the characters in the story. And granted, you would probably get a better appreciation of them having the context, but they could also work individually. So I decided to publish each one month at a time, starting in March. And they would be published as Kindle ebooks, which was easier than doing, the entire hardcover, paperback, etc. And then the big book, Bad Americans Part 1, I would publish in multiple formats. So that's what I did. And, I got readers for the books through my publicist and other, we were on a 6-month campaign to publicize the book. And I got great reviews on Amazon. And then, so far the regular part 1, the big book, has been very successful as well. We've gotten great reviews from Publishers Weekly, Kirkus, Midwest, all these different publications. So, and almost 100 reviews now on Amazon too, last time I checked. So anyway, I'm really proud of this book because it's my greatest narrative achievement. I'm proud of my other books too. They're all challenging. They were challenges to me artistically, but this is my greatest challenge yet. So. As I said, part 1 came out in September. The first story of part 2 just came out in October as an ebook, and we're going to go down the line again. And after the 6 stories come out, we're going to have the part 2 available in April. So, are there any questions about that so far? I'm going to just read a little bit from the book. You just get a sense of some of the characters in it, how it's set up, and then we can go into questions and answers. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning, orientation day. That's when so let me give you I realize I didn't give you this yet, the basic plot. So it's basically about a reclusive billionaire named Olive Mixer who's living in the Hamptons. He's actually, he lived in New York City, but he's living in his mansion in the Hamptons. He has multiple residences because he's very rich. And he's basically he got his wealth through owning dating apps. So he's the owner of multiple dating apps. And since everyone on the pandemic, especially single people, are on these apps because they can't go out and have been locked down in New York City, he creates a competition right after the first wave to have them come to his mansion complex and basically spend 12 nights there. They'll be dating each other, they'll be dining on extravagant cuisine, they'll be hanging out, they'll be doing all, just like if you watch The Bachelor, they're doing all these little activities, playing sports and all these other things. So it's exactly like that. So I kind of incorporate like a reality TV element too. There's like The Bachelor and Big Brother. It feels a lot like that, but it's kind of a subversive Big Brother, I guess. So anyway, so there are 12 Americans chosen. They are all vastly different in race, and ethnicity, and culture, and sexuality, in politics, and profession. So this is the very beginning where they kind of come in, and you'll see how the narrator kind of stereotypes them a little bit, but you'll see this is kind of part of the way the book works. You kind of see them initially as kind of, these kind of archetypes, but you realize that they're actually very complex. And that's how the book functions and also how the stories function too. Orientation Day, summer 2020. The Americans had arrived in the Hamptons and now stood in the den of the Desai-plex, 12 of them hanging out in the groups they had naturally formed after arriving and finding their rooms. They were waiting for their host, Olive Mixer, the reclusive billionaire who owned dating apps and had created the competition that had chosen them. They had been locked down by the government for months. Now they hoped to be free. 2 weeks of eating, activities, and dating in a secure environment. Finally, they could forget about the virus and death. They could be among people again. This was the getaway. Sung, head of security, stood at the center of the main den, next to a table filled with hors d'oeuvres. The conservatives were discussing the illegals and the great things the president had done. Meanwhile, the liberals were gossiping about the Road 2, the quarantine girl, and the skinhead. Sung was thinking about the Road 2 also. He had rapid tested them upon arrival. Both had come directly from Connecticut after quarantining at home and uploading tests. But Nalini, the corporate lawyer, had been driven by her father, so Sung needed to clear it for the two doctors, Alexa and Rashadi, before she could join everyone else. Her father was sitting at the local restaurant nearby for word in case she needed to be sent back. The other 10 had been picked up in limos. 5 had quarantined for 2 weeks in a different complex of bungalows on the North Shore that Olive owned, while the other 5 had self-quarantined at their homes in and around New York City, uploading regular tests. All were tested before they were cleared. Now they waited for Olive Mixer. They munched on food and drank cocktails served by Aries, one of the house staff. The liberals, lounging on beanies, included Rashawn Hall, an African-American teacher, Lisa Applebaum, a Jewish American blogger, Kathy Wei Kwan, a Taiwanese American social worker, and Andrea Mendoza, a Filipino American nurse. The conservatives clustered around the bar included Taylor Williams, a white financial analyst, Kasan Merdashev, a Chechen American dental hygiene student, Angela Diaz, an Ecuadorian American hair salon owner, and Sylvania Trainer, an Asian American transgender seamstress. The skinhead, Ricard Shaw, munched on a cracker alone in the corner near a TV and PlayStation, and another corner by an ornate curtain with an uncommon pair, Pritesh Lakshmi, an Indian computer engineer, and Haley Clark, a young model. Everyone noticed they seemed to already have a great rapport. Through that curtain on the right side of the den, a man emerged. He was tall and had an olive complexion. He wore a traditional black suit with a red tie. In each hand he held a book. One was the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, the other the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. He approached the center of the room and placed the books on the table where the hors d'oeuvres had been placed. Suddenly everyone realized the book was already there, but no one had seen it, The Arabian Nights. Olive clapped 2 times, and the second time he held his hands together flat as if he was praying to the crowd, or perhaps weighing to them in the Thai manner. It wasn't clear. Thank you all for coming. I'm Olive Mixer. I'm so happy you decided to be here with us. When this awful pandemic started, I knew it was going to be something we'd never experienced. Not only have we seen so many of our fellow New Yorkers get sick and die, but we've seen life as it was collapse. The isolation, the homeschooling, he said, looking at Rashawn. Even I have lost so many friends, so much so that my staff here has become like my family, and you will treat them as such, or I'll hear about it. And he goes on to describe how they're going to be, living at the mansion and going through these activities, and also why the fact that they had to tell a story each night. And they will be voted on based on the story, and based on that, they will have a punishment, which, as you'll see, normally will be isolation in a different complex, although it does differ at times. But so again, it kind of follows this kind of reality show format, and you'll see that there is a reason for all this, but you kind of have to read the book to find out. But the other thing one thing I kind of struggled with was how real to make it in terms of describing politics or things that were going on at the time. And I decided to make it really specific, which could theoretically make it dated. But because it's so specific, it kind of makes it feel more real. And I felt like even if you, and people have kind of mentioned this in the reviews, even if you were like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, because the themes are so timeless, it kind of doesn't matter that the details are so specific. It almost kind of reinforces itself. So that was something that I kind of struggled with as I was writing it, and as I was getting feedback too. Um, but I'm going to read a little bit from day one. This is so we have the frame story, and then we have each character on each day telling a story. But before they tell the story, we have a little bit about them. They wake up, and we kind of get their perspective on things, and then we kind of see what kind of story they tell, which is usually related to that, but not always. So we kind of have this kind of meta layer there. Um, so I'm just going to read from day one. So day one, the nurse is selected to read because she's the essential worker, and she's kind of like the honorary figure who's like upheld humanity during the pandemic. And then we get kind of more complicated characters after that. But this is just an example of that. So day one, Andrea woke with a start. She had dreamt about being at the hospital, swerving around people on gurneys in the hallway to try to save a patient in ICU. But as soon as she arrived, she saw the man wore an Otan gold death mask. Then she remembered where she was, 2 weeks in the Hamptons, a break from the madness. Not everyone had been so lucky. For months they had been denied vacation, but then there was nowhere to go anyway, unless you wanted to sneak out on a flight to Florida and never come back. Or you get the virus yourself, which often happened. Then you get 10 to 12, 14 days off, assuming you survived. The light was shining through the window. She preferred the natural light to the shade, and as she waded to the bathroom, she noticed a small red envelope under the door. Is it Chinese New Year? She wondered to herself, remembering her days as a maid in Hong Kong. She picked it up. The envelope, surrounded by gold trimming, was sealed with a small gold heart. She picked it with her nail, opened the envelope, and removed a plain white card. Inside was written, "Thank you for serving. Of all you are deserving to sound the first siren call. Do remember the tall order of your calling. When crafting your story, you can focus on the glory of the absolutely appalling failures of the elite. Or make something up. Life is short and sweet, or long and corrupt. Now, let's eat." An hour later, Andrea heard the call for breakfast and took the elevator down to the den, where she met Rashan and Lisa. Taylor, Angela, and Sylvania were also there. Sung spoke to someone over his headset. Then he led them to the 3 rooms and left the complex. The first featured an endless amount of electronic equipment, from iPads to iPhones to e-readers. Against the far wall were tabletops and chairs to plug in devices. A collection of board games rested on shelves in the corner shaped like a beehive. Espresso and vending machines were present too. And in the middle was an empty area where presumably people could play their board games or horse around. And he goes into a long description of everything there, and you kind of see how kind of ornate this place is, and kind of the gravitas they have there. And again, it kind of contrasts with the more intense stories of survival in the tales. So here you get the background of Andrea, who is a Filipino American nurse who has been battling the virus as a nurse in Elmer's Hospital. And of course, my mom working there gave me a lot of insight into that, along with other people I talked to too, who were nurses during the pandemic. So you get her perspective waking up, and you get her going into this this ornate setting, and then also her eating all this extravagant food, which you'll see day after day, the different things that are cooked. So you get that, and then you get her story at night. So I'm going to read a little bit of that too. One thing also that was challenging was, there's so many characters. There's the 12 guests. There's also like 12 staffs too. And so one thing was, with all these characters, will people get confused, et cetera, et cetera. So I had to write it in a way that people were still engaged, and then the characters were revealed as the book went on with their stories, etc. And based on the feedback that we got, and that was very successful at that. That was a pretty major challenge, though. So I'm going to read a little bit from Andrea's story. So every story has this person's story. So this is Andrea's story, and it also has another title, which is published in the published Kindle ebook. In this case, it's called On the Front Lines. Uh, I played around with the fact whether I wanted titles, whether I didn't want titles, and one of my beta readers gave me the suggestion. She actually read it 3 times, bless her heart. But she gave me a lot of really great suggestions, one of which was calling it this. So thank you. So anyway, I'm going to read a little bit from this to give you a sense of that from the beginning. And so you'll see, well, let me read it and I'll just describe it a little bit. Day 1, Andrea's story, aka On the Front Lines. This story is going to be about how ordinary people who work essential jobs stood up to this horrendous virus and tried to help people despite the incompetence of the establishment. You probably heard about a Chinese-American scientist who, just before the virus was in the Kirkland retirement home, had figured out it was spreading in Washington state. But no one listened to her because our incompetent, lying, selfish president was already calling it the China virus, and no one was going to listen to someone who was descended from Chinese, and the CDC and the bureaucratic people were spinning lies too. It's funny because in any society, there's a class of people the privileged look down on, even though, and maybe because, they are doing the essential work no one wants to do. I am from the Philippines, but I lived in Hong Kong as a maid to a rich family. Hong Kong Chinese people looked down on Filipinos and thought we were dirty, but we are what made the city run. On Sundays, we sat beneath the trains, bridges, and highways having a great time eating and partying, because the other days we were working. I bring that up to give you a basis for the rest of the story. Nurse Beatrice. We were going to start with a nurse. This is not because I am a nurse, but because nurses were on the front lines of the pandemic, so it was good to have their perspective. I'm going to call her Nurse Beatrice because it is a neutral, holy name and it protects the innocent. She immigrated to America in her early 20s without a nursing background, but she worked hard to finish a college degree here and go through all the courses, tests, training, and the ridiculous bureaucratic procedures an immigrant needs to compete to get on par with an American-born citizen. Eventually, she became a CNA, or certified nursing assistant, and worked in the neonatal ICU at Elmhurst. That's a prestigious job for a CNA. You are dealing with just-born babies, so that is very heartwarming indeed. However, there's a lot of politics in nursing, so I'm going to explain the nursing hierarchy and Beatrice's situation before we get to our main drama. So she kind of starts describing this kind of bureaucratic drama in her workplace, kind of like The Office or something like that. And so we get that initially, and then suddenly, she's transferred to the ICU, the regular ICU. Initially, she's in the neonatal unit, and she's transferred to the regular ICU. And then as soon as she does that, she starts having like supervisory responsibilities, and then boom, suddenly we get like this ER on steroids type situation where they have to battle to survive. And we get multiple perspectives, not only hers, but also a doctor. I don't know if you recall, but there was a doctor who was trying to get supplies for Elmhurst Hospital in the first days of the pandemic. And so it's kind of a doctor based on that doctor. And then we get also bus drivers and other people kind of come in and out. And then ultimately, even the staff has to fight for survival as well. So it's a very intense story. I think it works well for the first story in the book. And then you'll see also, you have the political perspective, which kind of differs from character to character. And because it was such a politically charged and other time, socially charged time, I really want to get that in there too, even though, some people tell me, well, you shouldn't put that in there because it's just too dated, whether it's going to be dated in 5-10 years, whatever, or, it's just why I have put politics in literature, but I thought it was important just to show how things were back then. And now too, and it's kind of funny. It's kind of a historical novel, also contemporary at the same time. But anyway, so that's just an example of some of the stories here. The stories are extremely diverse. So that story is kind of like it goes from perspective to perspective, but it's not in any particular style. Immigrants Unite is in spoken word, so it's in a poetic style. And Corona Chaos is a very tight story told in almost all prose. There's no dialogue. So it's completely different. They're all completely different from each other. And those two, by the way, interact with each other. Immigrants Unite by a very liberal social worker. Corona Chaos is by a very conservative financial analyst slash former soldier. So we get all these like kind of contrasting perspectives, but that also makes us understand the characters. And ultimately, the greater kind of goal of the book is to create this panoramic portrait of the time. Even though it's fiction, it's extremely realistic. So anyway, that's that, and then just wanted to show you. So this is the new way. This is my publishing company, my movement, my collective. At the moment there are 15 members, so we're all independent writers, and most of us have our own publishing companies too. So it's kind of like a creative collaboration, kind of like a move forward from the traditional publishing model. And if you think about, for example, the studio system in Hollywood in the 30s and how something like United Artists was formed, it's very similar that we're kind of maintaining our independence and collaborating as independents in this new world order in publishing and literature. So that's what that is, and obviously Bad Americans Part 2 is coming out in April. So are there any questions about the books or just my work in general? Yes.
Is part 2 going to be with the same characters, but moving along in the pandemic?
Yeah, so it's a continuation of the Frame novel. So because, I mean, it's, if you take it together, the book is like 220,000 words, I think, which 25,000. So it's not exactly War and Peace, but it's pretty long. Like it's, two very long books. So that's why I cut it in two. I mean, there are 6 stories in each book, 6 characters. So there are 12 characters in the book. 6 characters tell the stories in the first part, and 6 characters tell the stories in the second part. And in addition to that, the stories tend to be pretty long as well. I just tend to write long stories. But that's also because they're so comprehensive too. And so I would say the majority of stories are novelettes. They're like between short stories and novellas in terms of length. The only short story, there are 2 very short stories, which is Corona Chaos and ISIS Crisis, which is in the second book. That could kind of define as short story because of their word lengths. Immigrants Unite is it's a poem. Dope Double Dibbed, which is the last story in the second part, is actually a double story told by 2 people. If you read the book, you'll see why that happens. And it's a very high stakes competition. One is called a gangster rap, and the other one is told in more like an R&B style. So yeah, they're all extremely innovative in the way that they're told. And you also get this character's perspective along with that in a completely different aspect of the pandemic experience in the world. So it goes into all its issues like immigration, illegal immigration, undocumented, whatever you want to call it, racism during the pandemic. There's Black Lives Matter, and one of them, there's abortion. There's all these different issues are coming up and are dealt with in all these stories. So it's really, I wanted to get as much as possible into it. But yeah, to answer your question, it's a continuation of the Frame novel. Can you read the second book without reading the first book? I think so, but it's definitely preferable to read the first book. Because I would say that by the end of the first book, you really have a appreciation and care for the Frame characters, and that kind of leads into what happens in the second book. So yeah, but yeah, it was really meant to be one very big book, just like the Decameron or the Canterbury Tales. Canterbury Tales is actually never finished. Decameron is a very long book, but it's about maybe 800, 900 pages, just like this. The difference being that this has a much more kind of involved Frame story. So the Frame novel itself is a novel, it's a story. Whereas in the Decameron, it's like not, it's more can't just be there to tell the stories almost, So, any other questions? Okay. So if you want, I can read more from the book, or does anyone have? Well, I'll just read more from the book then. Give you a better sense of. I'll give you a sense of, for example, the difference between Immigrants Unite and Corona Chaos, which is two of the stories that kind of interact here. Right, so this is day two. This is Kathy's story. She's a 21-year-old Taiwanese American social work student. She just graduated from undergrad, and the pandemic hit. She was going to start her master's degree. So this is, she kind of sees a lot of the conservative like people in the house, and she's like really kind of upset about this. So this is like a story about like the undocumented and what they have to face in society. Day two, Kathy's story, aka Immigrants Unite. Illegal, a word that cuts off speech. Illegal, a concept that snaps off feet. Illegal, why even say it? Some will always blame others for their problems, easier than pondering the entire situation. Illegal, a word without meaning, definition, or feeling. Illegal, let's kill it. Now let me tell you a story about a strong woman Asian. Is she that model minority, perpetual foreigner, slanty-eyed best friend of a white chick on Hallmark, stamped on a bamboo ceiling, floor mat of white victims? That Asian? Not quite. Forget your biases. What do you think we're talking about? Some chink? A mysterious beauty, foreign but domestic, slippery but friendly. That China girl who is the object of your desire, David Bowie? Not quite. She's her own woman, college educated, a girl without boundaries. In China, they call her Sheng Nu, leftover woman, diseased and used, a chubby. Nope, she's not that either. She came to the USA as a tourist, but she's no anchor baby whore. In China, she was left over. Here, she's reborn, pristine, educated, but undocumented. That's the complication, that's the predicament. Is she scheming on street corners, talking weird men into dubious exchanges? Now she's hustling, making cheap car parts at an underground factory, working for a fat Korean guy who hires Chinese chicks because he likes their asses. I'm not making excuses. Look at this situation. She's a beautiful girl, smart, promising, harassed at work, raped in her hometown, escapes to America, land of the free, home of the brave, looking for a resurgence. How's she welcomed? She's told she's not welcome. So she's slaving and flushing, another brick in the wall of the consumer economy, sleeping on the floor of a two-bedroom with 15 of her coworkers. Do you remember another time when European immigrants, did the same shit? Living in tenements, ghettos too. Nativists called them southern races. Well, guess what? Now they're the effing racists. She should have stayed in China, just lived in her own place. Better, she was a princess, nice apartment, good family. But she wasn't free, not in body, not in mind. She wanted a new life. Now she's in a different type of prison in the capitalist cycle. Well, it goes on. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you get a sense of what it's like. And again, it's very kind of boundary pushing too. But it's in the spoken word style, and I did kind of run it past some sort of spoken word poets. So spoken word is kind of like drill, like in the very beginning. But it's kind of difficult to tell a story in spoken word, which is my a challenge to myself, and also her challenge in the story, because she's also someone who did spoken word competitions in college, and so it's her challenge to herself to tell an entire story in spoken word as well. So it's kind of both our challenges, character and author, let's just say. And I think it works very well. That's kind of like the beginning, but you get more into the actual story a little bit later in the story. And then I can read a little bit also from Taylor's story. So Taylor is kind of like, in some ways, the opposite. Like he's a very conservative, financial analyst and soldier, former soldier who served in Afghanistan and Iraq. He also, by the way, helped out in the food lines in Corona and in Long Island City when there were food lines and during the heart of the first wave of the pandemic. And so he's friends, for example, with one of the chefs who's like this Iron Chef guy type guy. But anyway, so yeah, his story is like the answer to this basically, which deals with how kind of open border and all this stuff has like made the country dangerous and this and that. So we get a sense of how his story is, which is completely different in style and in content. Day 3, Taylor's story, aka Corona Chaos. A man named Xavier Zambrano emigrated from Ecuador to Queens through his much older brother Eduardo, waiting over 20 years to come legally. His family owned a farm back in Guayas province, but he made his living as an agricultural engineer. When he immigrated to the United States with his family, he lived briefly with his brother in his modest home in Corona, but given that can-do American spirit, he immediately decided to make his own living and branch out. His brother Eduardo owned an Ecuadorian restaurant in Corona, and Xavier's wife Anna worked there as a waitress. Xavier's 2 children were very young, and he wanted to bring them up as strict Catholics, so he borrowed money from his brother and sent them to Catholic school. He rented his own apartment in a 3-story home in Queens, and he brought a medallion by borrowing money from the bank, which allowed him to work as a taxi driver. This was in 2013, when medallions were nearly $1 million, and right before Uber became big in New York City. As you might imagine, as the years went on, Xavier eked out a living, but he regretted his decision to get a medallion when he could have just waited and become an Uber driver. In debt to the bank, and too proud to ask Eduardo for more financial help, he decided his only bet was to keep driving. As the years passed, his brother Eduardo got sick of New York City. He was much older. His kids had graduated from college, and his wife had passed on years before. He decided to sell his restaurant and his house. He moved to North Carolina's Outer Banks, where he bought a cheaper house, lived off his investments, and settled into a peaceful life. As a favor, the new owner of the restaurant kept the current staff, and thankfully, Anna retained her job. Now, around 2016, some illegal Mexican gangs became prominent in one part of Corona and western Flushing. They wanted to expand their money-making ventures. Associated with El Chapo, they would stop at nothing to sell their product. One of the gang's leaders, Hector Lopez, set up shop in a house next to Xavier's. He noticed Xavier would park his cab nearby in the evening and take it out in the morning. He got an idea. The cab would be an ideal way to transport their product without being suspected. Hector befriended Xavier, acting like a concerned fellow Hispanic who would look after Xavier's wife and kids, protecting them from gangs and other predators. Of course, he was buttering up Xavier for the kill. One day, Hector was in his cab getting a friendly free ride to work in Woodside when he got Xavier to pull over in a deserted spot and stuck him up with a gun. His amigos came out of the woodwork and surrounded the cab, armed too. Xavier was forced to agree to transport Hector's product from his home, where to ride through Mexico after a circumvented route to different distribution centers around New York City and Long Island. Xavier was a good man, a devout Catholic, but he had a family, so he felt he had no choice but to comply. He knew he was doing the wrong thing. He would pull his taxi over and cry when he was alone, but he didn't know a way to get out of his predicament. Granted, Hector did pay him, but it was a pittance. The real reason he kept doing it was a threat to his family if he veered away from his job even a little bit. And it goes on. This is a relatively short story, but it's with a very powerful impact. And actually, a lot of the comments, one person actually called it, I think, a master class in a short story. I'm not saying that's true, but it's a lot like I don't know if you've read the Canterbury Tales, but we have the Miller's Tale and the Reeves Tale. The Miller's Tale is some consider it to be a perfect short story, even though it's in Middle English and it's in poetic verse, I guess. This is the way the story is. So it's actually kind of like a very funny story. It's a practical joke kind of story, but because of the way that it's done. And the Reeves Tale is like kind of the opposite of it in a sense. And the Reeve and the Miller hate each other, and they're like, So it's very similar to what I did with these two stories. One in spoken word, one by a very liberal person, and one by a very conservative person, and their styles are completely the opposite. But they both work really well as stories. And they, as I said, they've all gotten praise. But the entire point was to have each story be different and impactful, but in a different way. And together they kind of create this panoramic portrait and powerful portrait. So, is there any more questions? Yes.
You said you thought about this 25 years ago, right? So how, I'm assuming that it changed what you were going to write and ultimately what you
Well,
ended up
yeah,
writing.
yeah. So 25 years ago, I was, struggling to find my voice and all that stuff. Like obviously I was a college kid. I mean, I had written novels in high school. I'm sure they were very bad. I don't even want to go back and read them. But at Wesleyan, I took, I was writing. I got some stuff published. Even in high school, I was pretty successful at publishing stuff, especially poetry. And then at Wesleyan, I was successful with my short stories. I won an award called the Wesleyan Fiction Award. One of my teachers was Daniel Handler, who's probably knows now, Lemony Snicket, but he took a really good liking to me and he would read my stories. I read a collection when I was there too. But anyway, by the time I got to Oxford, I was still kind of trying to all these different forms, and so I was experimenting a lot. And so I thought to myself, well, what would be the greatest experimentation? It would be to write a story within a story. And then how about having a lot of stories within a story, right? So that's when I was like, well, the Decameron does that, but it doesn't really have such a great frame narrative. So that's when I first got the idea that one day I should challenge myself. Once I was good enough to do it, let's just say, that I would challenge myself to do that. So whether or not it would be during a pandemic, that I wasn't really sure about. Um, Now, when it came time to kind of getting to it in 2019, that's when I first started thinking about it. And I did think about doing it during the pandemic just because of the camera had done during the pandemic. And then the stuff with China started happening. Well, we didn't realize at the time it would come here or everywhere, right? So that's when I kind of got the idea that, well, you could just do it at a fictional virus or whatever it was happening. And they would just be in the library and they would be kind of telling stories with the books in the background. So you have that meta layer as well. But then when it actually happened, then I was like, wow, this is perfect. I can actually do it based on what happened here. Um, and even with that, I mean, I sent this book out. I remember I sent it to, I can't remember, I mean, one of the university presses, and they were like, oh, well, I don't know if I'm really so into it set during the COVID pandemic. Maybe if it was set during another pandemic or a fictional pandemic. I was like, yeah, but that defeats the entire purpose of the book. Like, so you get all these comments from people, but one person's like, for example, this is really difficult to traditionally publish because, first of all, it's really long, but also all the stories. First of all, it's never been done other than the Middle Ages one, where someone is told by the characters in the story. But also, these stories are extremely long. By stories published in journals are much shorter. The only ones that could possibly fit maybe are Corona Chaos and Kassan's story, Isis Crisis, in the second book. Um, so yeah, I mean this is, and also all the stories are different lengths. Like Black Boy's Ballad, Rashawn's story, which is the fourth story. That's a novella. It's 120 pages long, whereas Corona Chaos is like only a few pages long. So and I did that deliberately because I wanted to reflect the characters also, and based on what they would type of story they would tell. And it's the same thing in Canterbury Tales. The Knight's Tale is extremely long, whereas the Miller's Tale and Reeve's Tale are relatively short. So I wanted to kind of mimic that as well. So to answer your question, though, I had the idea of what I would do stylistically back then, and how I would challenge myself to do that once I was good enough of a writer to do that, which I wasn't at the time. But trust me, I tried. But at this point, I had published this trilogy of books, which was also gotten acclaim. And Dance Towards Death, won 15 literary honors. So at that point, I thought I was good enough to do it. So I did. So, and it took 5 years to do it, by the way. But ultimately, I did it, and I'm very proud of it. Yep.
So, I haven't read it, but, so we have 6 different stories. Are you, are you, is there a message that you want to send to everybody through the stories, or are those really more of a independent stories and you're leaving it to the interpretation of the reader?
Yeah, I mean, one of the famous things, I guess, about this is that it is very interpretational because you kind of get it's the same thing in Good Americans too, by the way, which is the first book in the Human Tragedy. The stories kind of come at you from this perspective, and you kind of by the end you're kind of like, first of all, you're deeply impacted, but secondly, you're also meant to think about, you know, about it and what you think of what happened, you know, and that's true in every single one of these stories too. I would say my overall arc, you know, I dedicated the book to all my fellow Americans, and the the quote at the beginning is a quote from Walt Whitman. I'll read it because I think it's very important to what the book is getting at. Um, So it goes, what is any nation after all, and what is any human being but a struggle between conflicting, paradoxical, opposing elements? And they themselves, in their most violent contests, important parts of that one identity and its development. So, you know, he was writing right before the Civil War in the 1860s, and he was kind of talking about that. And remember, that division between slavery in the northern and southern states, that had been going on for decades before the Civil War. And similarly, we live now in a time of great division, right? And it didn't just happen during the pandemic. That just elevated what was already there. So that's what I kind of wanted to get at, and that's why also I kind of left a lot of political stuff too. But also, as he talks about, it's not just the nation, but the nation is comprised of people, and the people are also paradoxical and conflicted even within themselves. Like for example, Taylor is extremely conservative, but you know he's also helping on the front lines. He was in Iraq and Afghanistan. He believes in liberty and all that stuff, at least in theory, right? But he's also extremely opposed to quote unquote legal immigration. So, you know, and again, you know, you see the complexity of the characters. They're not just archetypes. They're fully formed human beings with contradictions. And that's what makes the book and the stories work so well. So in Corona Chaos, you get the kind of this contrast between what he kind of believes and what he kind of sees, in a sense, you know, objectively. So that's really what I wanted to convey through it: the complexity of the human condition and of the individual, and how even with all this division, we still have, you know, we're all human. We need to live on the planet together. So that's kind of what the book gets at. Anything else? Okay. I think that, yeah, it's 8 o'clock anyway. So yeah, if you're interested, I have my books for sale. I have both The Bad Americans Part 1, the new book, and I also have my older books too, The Brother Chronicle and Good Americans, which is the first book. So if you're interested, I will definitely sign the book for you. You'll get a bookmark from the New Way and also a sticker. So, and I even have a bag from the New Way I'm selling as well. So, um, but yeah, I appreciate you all being here. I hope if you haven't read the book, you'll check it out. As I said, it's gotten great reviews from everybody who's read it. And I do think you got a lot out of it. And, you know, it was my pride in writing it and struggling over it. So I think you'll appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Please, sir, can I buy a book?
Sure. Would you come up to my desk?